I'd like to introduce our guest today, David Buerge. David has been a teacher, historian, and writer. He's an alum of the University of Washington and the Peace Corps. He's been researching the history of the greater Seattle area since the mid-1970s. He has published 14 books of history and biography. I took a history class from him about 15 years ago and was very impressed with the content of his knowledge. His book, Chief Seattle and the Town That Took His Name, is an excellent source of information. Thank you for sharing with us today, David.
Well, thank you for having me, Edie. It's wonderful to be here. And again, to be able to talk with you, it's always fun.
Thank you, and I am going to start by asking you questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
How have you become familiar with the history of the Shoreline area? And where did you learn the Lushootseed names for the area?
I'll answer the second part of that first. The Lushootseed names were the reasons why I got interested in Native American history in the area in the first place. They come from T.T. Waterman, who was a linguist that came to Seattle from California, probably in the early teens of the 20th century, and he taught at the University of Washington for a year or two. And he interviewed a lot of Native people at the time, and he was interested in collecting place names. And he collected hundreds of them, about 700 place names. And the people that he interviewed, who were the informants who gave him the information, said, "Oh, if only you had come earlier. The older people could have told you so much more." And so he said there were probably thousands of place names originally, surely. You had tens of thousands of people living here, and so, and wherever they lived, of course, life was immediate to them there. And so the places were named. I mean, as a kid growing up, we remember where we grew up, we had names for places. And it's just a natural human capacity to name your environment so you can understand it better. Well, likewise here, and you know, for Native and non-Native people as well. But anyway, it was in the early 1970s, and I was teaching on Vashon Island, and an old guy, his name was Marshall Soul, I taught his granddaughters, and he came up to me. In those days, we didn't have walls between classrooms because the levies wouldn't pay for them, so we had to just, it was called the arena. And so this tall, gaunt old guy came up and he came right into my class. And he said, "You might be interested in this." And he handed me a microfilm, and it was of T.T. Waterman's manuscript called the Puget Sound Geography. And it was all the place names that he had collected for the Puget Sound area. And so I would spend my days teaching, and then I would take the bus to Seattle at night and then go to the library, and because they had a microfilm reader there, they didn't on Vashon at the time, and then I would begin to go through, and I was just stunned at what I read. I had no idea. First of all, they were difficult to understand because they were written in a language I didn't know, and also written in a way that I really had to learn because there were symbols. Lushootseed, as you know, I mean, has sounds that are not familiar to English people, and so linguists use symbols to write them, and I had to figure out what the symbols meant. But anyway, and then Waterman in his notes would refer to the mythology of the area that had been written down by another local, Arthur Ballard of Auburn. And so I got Ballard's mythology, and then I was doubly amazed because here, I mean, I'd grown up here. And then here are hills and rocks that have myths associated with them. When I heard the word myth, I always thought of either classical myths or Middle Eastern myths. I had never imagined that there would have been a mythology of the area where I grew up in. And so I went to find these places that were mentioned and located by Waterman. And it changed my life. And it opened up an entirely new vista for me. And so from that time on, from the early 70s on, I was absolutely fascinated by this topic, and it has never left me. So Waterman was a source. And then I later found that there was another linguist, John Peabody Harrington, who came through. He didn't collect as many names as Waterman did, but because he spoke with different informants, he got different names. And so you put them together and you get a sense of how the people saw the land and how they thought about the land. And to me, it's been a revelation. And it's like the people come alive. You know, at the time when I was doing this work, I had no idea the Duwamish still existed as a corporate body. And then I discovered, oh, they did, because they contacted me. And so but then at that time they had an office in Buerge. So then I became associated with the Duwamish tribe. I was absolutely delighted to meet them. These are the descendants of the people whose information I was reading. And then they basically welcomed me and had me work for them. And I never forget the hospitality. I never could. But the warmth of the reception, because, you know, as a white person, you don't know how you're going to be received. But they were marvelous, and they said, you know, what you have uncovered, we would like to be able to use for our purposes, and like the petition, and that even made me feel better, because it was like I was doing something useful for the tribe. So that's how I got the place names, and that's how I became aware of the information, and that's pretty much where it comes from. Those two individuals, Waterman and Harrington.
And then you talk about things, the natives before the settlers arrived,
Yeah.
which made your book somewhat unique in that no settlers necessarily were interpreting what was going on. And I'm curious how did the tribes decide what areas each tribe was from, and how was that communicated to each other?
Yeah, and that's an ongoing concern, and I will basically, I can answer it by referring to the people I mentioned, like Waterman, and he wanted to know, well, okay, I have these Duwamish place names. Where, what are the limits of the Duwamish land? Where do the Duwamish live, and what did they regard as other people's land, and how did other people regard the Duwamish land, homeland, and all that? And so he started asking questions with this in mind. I want to learn more about the people and their idea of their homeland. And so he kept asking, and people said, well, if you want to know about the real Duwamish, they're the people who live in Renton. Well, who are these other people? Well, they're related to them. How are they related to them? Well, they intermarry, but they intermarry in different ways. And so, for example, if you live on Elliott Bay, you're saltwater people, Shwangchash. And that means that you're more closely related to other saltwater people on Puget Sound than not. And also but because you're dependent on the fishery of the Duwamish River, you're intermarried with them too. Because if you want to, people have places that are theirs. There are longhouses, there are villages. Some of these villages have been around for thousands of years, pretty much in the same areas, because the same areas are attractive for specific reasons, and unless those attractions change, the village stays there. The longhouses tend to move around because they have to be rebuilt about every generation, but the village area pretty much stays the same. Well, if you grow up there, that's your land. The burial ground is near the village. So when you're buried, you're there permanently. And if you, say, married into the village and you died, well, you would be taken back to the burial ground of your original birth village. And how do I know that? Well, because people mention that. Native people mention that, but also pioneers said, I remember looking, this is in southern Lake Washington, they were taking the body of so-and-so back to her homeland for burial. So you pick that up and you make sense of it. And, but the point was, if you have a village and you have a longhouse, and a lot of this, of course, is based on the work that was done by anthropologists in the early 20th century, who essentially were adopted into the groups. I'm thinking of Marion Wesley Smith, who was adopted into the Puyallup Nisqually people. And she wasn't formally adopted, but Marion Wesley Smith had, I think it was muscular dystrophy, so she was confined to a wheelchair. So the people felt very protective of her. And she developed a wonderful relationship with them. So they were very concerned about her welfare. And so they told her what they could. Her job as an anthropologist was to interview them and try to understand their life, to interpret it for the non-native audience. And so they respected her and respected that, and they respected their own heritage enough to want to share it with people. And so she did. And so they told her that if you grow up in a longhouse, each longhouse is supposed to be independent. In other words, the people should be self-supporting. And so you need all these different kinds of people for the longhouse to flourish. You need hunters, you need fishermen, you need mothers, you need fathers, you need basket weavers, blanket makers, tool makers, singers, storytellers, speakers, all these people for the longhouse to be able to function effectively. And it's like an extended, it is an extended family because it's made up of these biological families that are all interrelated. So you live in the same house for the winter months, but then come February, you have to go out and begin to collect the foods you'll need for the next winter months when you stay, and also to stay alive during that time. So for 9 months out of the year, the families move around and they go to these various spots. And Marion Wesley Smith was told, if you knew the family, you knew exactly where they'd be at any time of the year, because they always went back to the same places. They were their places. And what I've been able to pick up is that there's all this folklore, there's all these myths and legends and stories, and a lot of them relate to very specific places. So for example, there's a rock in North Seattle, it's just below Magnolia Bluff, it's called 4 Mile Rock, and there's a myth about it. And there are other rocks, but this rock, because it's bigger, has myth associated with it. And sometimes along the beaches you'll find there's lots of big rocks, but only one rock will have a myth associated with it. So my question was, why this rock as opposed to the others? And also, why a lot of the myths are associated where rivers come together. Well, why there? Why not some other place? And what I was able to come up with is, well, those stories were told by individuals. Individuals came from families, and those families collected at a number of areas. And if you knew the story about what happened there that made that area fertile to begin with, then in a sense it was like a title deed. If you knew the stories, if you could recite them, then you knew the area well enough to say, well, yeah, this is where the clams are, this is where the camas fields are. We cultivate this particular root here, we cultivate these ferns there. These are ours. And if you want to use them, you need our permission. And you get that by marrying into our family. And so that's the underlying premise of marriage, was that it was done to widen a group's economic base. But to begin with, you have areas where the land isn't owned, but the rights to collect the resources belong to the families. And so if those families are Duwamish families, then those resource areas are Duwamish resource areas. And again, the idea of setting off land with boundaries, that was a practice further inland where you had hunting areas and you had to know where the animals went. And so the hunting, the area that certain herds of deer inhabited had to be known by the hunters. And so they were more akin to say, well, it's this valley and that valley, which ends at this range of hills and that range of hills, which are borders, essentially borders. That wasn't such much the case lower down in the rivers. Well, anyway, the long and short is that these use areas were used by peoples, and if you wanted to share in those, you had to marry into the groups. And so the Duwamish had close marital ties with the Suquamish. They had close marital ties with the Muggleshoots, with the Snoqualmie, with other groups. They were more closely intermarried with one another, especially on the rivers, because the river people built these big weirs across channels, not necessarily across the river and its downstream, but nevertheless, each weir, which was a big, like a log fence, and was erected during fishing season, had the capacity to catch every fish that came upriver. Well, that would have been stupid, because you would have killed off the fish. And if you live on the river, you've got a lot of villages, and each of them have a weir. Well, how are you going to operate these weirs so that you don't cause conflict? And you did that by establishing protocols between villages. Okay, we're gonna put our weir screens in this time, and we're gonna take them out so that the fish can come up your way. We're gonna calibrate the distance between the stakes in the weirs so that fish of a certain size can get through. And those protocols were absolutely important, and that's how the peace between the groups was maintained. And it was so effective that it led to the phrase, "Every river has its people." That was a Swinomish man, John, he said, "Every river has its people." And when you think about it, it makes sense, because all these fishing protocols along the stream required cooperation, and that cooperation was maintained through intermarriage. Now that wasn't so true on the lakes, because when you built a weir on a lake, you built it on a tributary coming into the lake, and the stream or the creek wasn't big enough to have another village upstream, so you didn't have to worry about, fishing a stream. And I mean, you wouldn't fish a stream out because you wanted the fish to return, obviously. That was the thing. All these fish runs were managed so well that when the settlers came, they saw literally millions of fish returning, and they assumed this is the bounty of nature. Well, no, this was an aspect of successful management of the fishery. And of course, it only took 2 generations for the whites to wipe that out. So now we have, less than 1 million fish coming in a year to Puget Sound, where before there were probably at least 10 million.
And before the settlers came, there were natives from bands from Canada coming down.
Yes.
And different places attacking. And so how did Chief Self handle trying to stop the...
Well, it was actually Kitsap or Kitsap who was, historically there are several Kitsaps in the Puget Sound area, so it was a family name, and like Siak, it was passed down through the family. It was an inherited name. That marked you as noble. You had, and it's like in England, you have, a person has a regular Christian name, but then there'll be Lord or Lady somebody, and that's their ancestral name. And likewise, it was true here. So you had names that were passed down through family lines, and constantly they were reused in that way. So Kitsap was originally descended from a Green River, actually from Yakima. They came way, in the early 1700s, they came over the passes, and then they were on the Green River, and then the man named Kitsap married into the Suquamish, and he became a war leader there. And Seattle was born in the 1780s, and he was still a small child when a group of raiders from Vancouver Island came down and attacked the people at Salmon Bay in Ballard. Killed most of them, left a row of severed heads on the beaches as a calling card, and took a lot of women and children off as slaves. And the reason why they did that was because they were dealing with these epidemics that were inadvertently brought in by Western traders they killed off as many as 50% of the population because the people had no immunities to these. And so what they needed to do was rebuild their population so they could maintain the lifestyles that had enabled them to flourish and succeed. So anyway, Kitsap came up with the idea, individually we can't defeat these northern raiders, they're simply too strong for us, but if we join together, we might be able to respond more effectively. And so he started creating an alliance, and he would ask the leaders to meet at his village at Suquamish, and then he had there was a house there, a big building, and he said, add an apartment to it, and so when we meet, you'll have a place to go. And that's how Old Man House grew up, 600 feet long. He created this alliance. Seattle was a young man at this time. His father and he and a lot of other people from the Cowlitz River, which is to say from the Columbia, all the way up to the Snohomish, to Whidbey Island. A lot of those groups formed this alliance, this confederation, and then when they were ready, an armada of probably 200 canoes went north to attack the Cowichans on Vancouver Island, who were the source of most of these raids. Now the attack was a disaster for the Puget Sound people, but it so impressed the Cowichans, who thought, oh, these are the people we normally attack and we capture slaves from, and now here they are attacking us in our home waters. This is different. And so both Kitsap and the Cowichan chiefs apparently decided to use a traditional way to bring peace, which was when a new and vigorous group enters your territory, you will probably have to fight them. But there's a better way, and that is to intermarry. So if you intermarry with them, then the etiquette of family and kinship mitigates the violence. And so that's what happened to all these Puget Sound, with all these Puget Sound groups and the Cowichans, they intermarried. And Seattle, Chief Seattle was one of these people who was involved in that process. And so your great-great-grandmother was one, a Duwamish, and his own daughter, Angeline, married a half-Cowichan man on Whidbey Island. So, and Seattle every fall would go north to fish in the Fraser River. Well, he could not have done that without these agreements between, and without these marital relationships that he developed, that the Puget Sound people developed with the, so that's how they dealt with, and so basically what the model was you have to work together, but also intermarriage is probably the best way to deal with the problem. And so later in life, Seattle internalized that lesson. And after 1849, when there was a raid on Fort Nisqually down south of Tacoma, ended up with several Americans being killed, Seattle, who was a war leader, determined that the Americans are coming in, they're already fighting with Native people, and there's a better way, and we need to intermarry with them. And so he invited Americans to come north to settle in the Duwamish homeland, and they did. And for the most part, the young single American men did intermarry with the Native people. And for a few years, the town of Seattle, which was an experiment that Seattle had created to see, his idea was if we intermarry, then both groups can prosper. And he was right, because for the first few years, the little community of Seattle prospered mightily. It became a center of shipping. It became eventually the greatest coal port on the Eastern Pacific. It was a lumber exporter, although Seattle was growing so rapidly that it consumed most of the lumber that was cut in the area. But the point was that it worked. And it was Seattle's idea. And all the other pioneers that came agreed, and they named their town after him, because he was the one who came up with the idea, who invited the Americans in, and the Indians and the Americans were cooperating to produce this viable settlement. And during the Indian War of 1855, the Yakima Indian War, the city persevered and continued to prosper. All the young whites were in the militia. They were drilling for the militia. And who ran the law? Who ran Yesler's mill? Well, it was the Native people. They were the ones running the mill, while the young white men were off fighting other groups. And so the Duwamish remained, the lower river Duwamish remained allied with the Americans, did not participate in the war against them. And as, of course, then you had a new generation of Americans coming in who were unaware of what Seattle had done and brought in their racial bias with them, thought, the last thing they wanted to do was live with Indians, and so they moved them away. They had reservations where they created reservations away from white settlements. And Seattle wanted whites and Indians to work and live together. But the Americans said, no, we are separate peoples, we need to live separately, so they moved the Indians off the reservations. And by that time, Seattle was a going concern. But the idea of working together cooperatively, living together, even loving together, that was a victim of history. And Seattle's vision went unrealized, I would say, until the last 20 or 30 years, when finally the respect that the Native people deserved has been accorded. It's taken time.
And that leads me to my next question,
Yeah.
because the Duwamish have not yet received federal recognition.
That's right.
And they say one of their decisions was based on the fact that they didn't appear to continue as a cohesive organization. What do you think, first of all, why do you think there should be federal recognition, and what do you think needs to happen to
Yes.
make that happen?
This is a grotesque miscarriage of justice. I mean, this is Seattle's, the city of Seattle, the modern city of Seattle's original sin. This is the sin that basically bedevils the city still. And it is that, again, when the American officials who came in, bringing their racism with them, wanted to move the Indians out, and they succeeded. Although many Duwamish simply refused to go, because this is our homeland. Why do we want to leave? Also, and even Seattle said this, when during the Indian War, and there's this conversation he's supposed to have had with Leshai, and he said, don't kill the Americans who have married Indian wives. A lot of these people have Indian wives. Yesler, Maynard, they all have Indian wives. Don't kill them. And so the Indians did not. But after the war, the Indians were literally pushed off their lands. And it's a terrible irony, because the reason why the Duwamish never received a reservation in their homeland, which is the lower Duwamish River, is because Seattle was a going concern, because Seattle was a prosperous town. And it was already shipping coal down the Black and Duwamish rivers to San Francisco. They were getting $30 a ton for coal that they shipped to San Francisco. They were shipping out lumber. The last thing the settlers came to Seattle because the government was giving away land free. If you settled on it for 4 years and made improvements, that is, planted something there, had a garden, built a house, you could get it free. They were literally giving land away. This was the Indians' land that they were giving away. And once you got a homestead patented, which means once after 4 years you finally got the claim from the government, you could then sell it. You could sell the whole thing, you could sell parts. And that's what the settlers depended on for a large part of their income, and they all wanted to become rich. And they had the capacity to become rich because, again, the little town of Seattle was an economic magnet. People were coming into it, they needed to live somewhere, so they bought lots to live on. And those lots made the pioneer families wealthy. So when government officials suggested, okay, the Duwamish have a legitimate claim for a reservation in the area, we think it should be at the forks of the Duwamish, which is where the lake outlet from Lake Washington met the Cedar River, formed the Black River and the Duwamish. And they wanted the Duwamish to have a reservation there. Well, the white residents of the city of Seattle in 1865 came together and sent a petition to their delegate in Congress. They weren't a state, they were just a territory. They had one delegate, non-voting delegate in Congress, and that was Arthur Denny. And they said, you want to end this right now, because if we don't want them to withdraw land from the public domain and give it to the Duwamish for a reservation, because that's how we make our money here. And so they didn't. And on several occasions, Indian agents wrote letters back to Washington, D.C. We need these people, they've allied with us. These people have supported us during the war. Their enemies, they were their enemies too, but the people who attacked the people of the U.S. Army and the militia, they got their reservations. As a matter of fact, the Lushootseed group got it because they did fight the Americans. They were the upriver, people who lived upriver, the Duwamish. But the people who supported the Americans, Duwamish, got nothing because the settlers didn't want them to. So that persisted, and they never received a reservation in their homeland. So for generations, they lived, and they could not own or claim land. If they denied their Indianness, they could then purchase land, but they had to cut any tie to any reservation, to any tribe. Did we lose power?
No.
Okay. And so that persisted until 1974, and when Judge Bolt made his decision, the famous fishing rights decision, which worked for the recognized tribes. Now, when the Duwamish weren't given a reservation, that meant that they were a landless tribe, that the government did not recognize them in the same way that it recognized tribes with reservations. And so in 74 said, well, when the Bolt decision came out in 74, officials said, well, these rights, and Bolt said, they relate to tribes with reservations, not to tribes without. So the Duwamish, who were the first signatories of the Treaty of Point Elliott, whose chief, Seattle, was the primary figure at the Point Elliott Council, they were declared landless and unrecognized. And so they couldn't access the rights that they had signed away, that they had signed the Treaty of Point Elliott to get. And that unjust situation persists. And for reasons that I cannot fathom, a lot of recognized tribes don't want the Duwamish to be recognized. And the only reason that I can come up with is that they are afraid that if the Duwamish are recognized, then the federal pie is cut that much thinner for them. That was the argument against the Snoqualmie being recognized. There were several other unrecognized tribes that have been recognized. And they've essentially ganged up, the recognized tribes have ganged up to prevent the Duwamish from becoming recognized, and they concoct all these descriptions, like you say, well, they're not really a tribe. Well, no, they are a tribe. They've been recognized as a tribe by the government since 1855, and they're still a people, an Indian people. They just don't have a reservation. And so that's what the Duwamish are trying to, that's what the injustice the Duwamish are trying to reverse, is this. And it's just cowardice on the part of Seattle city officials who suddenly, the Duwamish, who are the Duwamish? Are they a people? They pretend they don't know. Yeah, and the reason why Seattle is as rich as it is today is because they got money selling land, the Duwamish's land. And so that's where that issue and that controversy arises from.
And my last question has to do with your book. Mm-hmm. What's the most important thing you hope people will get from reading your book, and then tell us where people can buy it?
Okay. Well, the most important thing, first of all, is to know more about the man, Seattle. You know, it's interesting. Jesus only had to wait 40 years before the Gospel of Mark was written. Seattle has waited 160 years before anybody sat down to actually write a serious account of his life, which I find inexplicable. In the longest day, did I ever imagine I would be the one to write that? Never. It never occurred to me. As a matter of fact, back in the 1970s, when somebody said, because I had been doing the work with the Duwamish place names and the myths and all that, they said, well, why don't you write a biography of Chief Seattle? And I laughed, and I said, why don't you ask me to write a biography of Jesus or King Arthur? There are more primary sources describing them than there are Seattle. And I have all the primary sources I have about Chief Seattle fit into a folder this size, maybe a quarter of an inch thick, that's it. And I said, you can't write, there's nothing that's really known for sure about him. Oh no, you could do it. And then I took a chance, and then that originally didn't work out. And it left me in debt. And because publishers, a literary representative said, no, this will sell big in New York. Well, no. And he asked me to write one. I said, it will take years of research to do this. No, just write a couple of chapters now. Well, I wrote basically what everybody else had been able to say up to that point, and it didn't go anywhere. So I was left holding the bag, as it were. And so as an expression of passive aggression, I decided, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna show the world that this can be done. But it took 24 years. But in that time, and picking together everything I could, finding everything I could about Seattle, putting it together, then trying to figure out where, what is more accurate than others, how do you even tell this story? I believe I came in contact with the man. And what I came in contact with was a man who was a very gifted speaker, but also a very funny person. He had a wonderful sense of humor. He had a kind of he would have loved Monty Python. He had an absurd sense of humor. He used to love, for example, when it came time to give a squigway, which was their word for potlatch, he would put two canoes together and put a deck on it with planks, and then he'd get all the stuff that he wanted to give away during his potlatch, and then he would be paddled out about 30, 40 feet from shore, and he'd throw in the water, and he'd make the people dive in after it. And he thought that was hysterically funny. He also threw a wrestling match by asking the people, his families, well, I have this guy who's a good wrestler. I want to make sure he can't be held by another person, so I need something to make his skin slippery. So the women gave him their cosmetics, and so he greased the fellow up, and the guy won. So he basically, swung a wrestling match. Well, and also he loved to marry people. He was a huge matchmaker, and he would accompany people so that they didn't have to appear in court. He would witness for them, and he would do all these things, and because he simply loved to bring people together. He seemed to be like a Jewish Yenta in that regard. He just loved to be a matchmaker. I mean, so he's a very interesting fellow, and there's a wonderful story that was given to me when I was talking about, after the book had been published, and I was going from group to group describing who Chief Seattle was. And I was at the Pioneer Society down near Madison Park in Seattle, and a woman came up to me and she said, my great-great-great-grandfather told his children, that's been passed on in my family line, that when either his wife or his son's wife had children, when his wife had children, they were twins. And Seattle made a special trip to see the twins, because they were these little blonde-haired, blue-eyed girls. And we've always been told this story. Well, twins in Native society were looked at as something freakish. Twins, litters are what animals did. They weren't how humans bore their children. And so they were looked upon in a very strange way. But in settler society, they weren't. And so Seattle wanted to see these. Now, he was an old man. This is probably a year or two before he died. And so he made a special trip, the guy's in his late 70s, just to see these two little girls with their blonde curls and blue eyes. He just wanted to see them because he thought that was fascinating to see. And they were twins. I mean, they looked identical, so he wanted to see that. And so that's the kind of person he was. Well, you never would get that from what we had known. But I fortunately was able to get a lot of this together, and people shared these stories with me. And finally I put it together, and so that he becomes a very different kind of person than the one we normally expect. He was a terrifying war leader for most of his life, but then in his 60s, he made this big switch. And instead of, at one point in 1848, he agreed, yes, we need to drive the Americans out because they're taking our land. And then there was a big shootout at Fort Nisqually in 1849, on May Day of 1849, and then he came, and also he had led an attack in 1845 on the Chemicum people near Port Townsend, in which his oldest son had died, had been killed by a shot that severed his spine. And that made Seattle reflect on his employ. He had been a war leader, and he decided this was not workable anymore. And also he did not want to fight the Americans. He wanted to prosper with them. He wanted to be closer to them. So all those things combined to, in late life, change the trajectory of his life. Well, that's the kind of man that interested me. And that's the kind of man that emerged from the research. And so the most important thing about the book is that people understand this, that this is not just some cigar store Indian that had, and also, anyway, the pioneers changed a lot of their early history because they were embarrassed by it. The fact that they were made to feel embarrassed for the fact that they had named a town after an Indian. Why would you do that? And then again, they're trying to defend themselves against these Americans that are coming in with racist baggage. It's not to say they weren't racist, they were, but not in the same way. A lot of them had married into native families. So anyway, you have to deal with that, the fact that history has been rewritten over time. You have to correct history. But the more important thing was that this was a man who was visionary, for whom the city of Seattle probably would not have been created, and who defended it in a time of war, who made sure that there were two cases where famine was averted in Seattle because Seattle prevailed on his neighbors, native neighbors, to provide the settlers with potatoes, to see them through a time of want until the ships could come in with, that they could buy supplies from. Well, that's the kind of man he was. He was an impresario. He created a town, and he nurtured a town, and he defended a town. And so they named it after him, as would make sense. That's the kind of man that he was. That's the kind of man people should know. And this famous speech that he supposedly gave, I believe there's a kernel of truth in it, but the man who wrote it, Henry Allen Smith, had Seattle presented Seattle as a person saying, oh, my people are dying, blah, 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 we are not long for this world. Seattle would never have said anything like that in his life because he wanted his people to prosper with the Americans, not apart from the Americans, not in spite of the Americans, not against the Americans, but with them. He was not going to say, my people are dying soon, you know, you'll control this whole. No, that was what the words Smith put into his mouth. But what Seattle did say was that you need to treat our people with justice and kindness. That he did say. And also he said, we may, you know, your numbers are growing, you may outnumber us, but we have been here for an awfully long time, and our graves are filled with our ancestors. And when you die, you've left your families, God knows where, and now you're here. And when you die, you're going to be buried here. So you're going to have all these native dead to consider, because you're going to meet them in the next world. So be kind to us and treat us justly, because the dead are not altogether powerless. And so that's the best argument he could give to Isaac Stevens, who was very full of himself at the time. And that's what he said. You know, we deserve respect, we require respect, and it is only justice that you treat us in this way. And now we're beginning to realize that. And so, as you know, there's popular support for the Duwamish becoming recognized because people increasingly realize it's only justice that after 160 years, they should finally be given the rights that were promised to them by the Treaty of Point Elliott. A long-winded answer to your question.
And where can we buy the book?
Well, as far as I know, any bookstore, now it's just come out in paperback this fall, but the price is only $2 less from the hardbound. But it's available, and so any bookstore you can get it from.
Will they be able to get it at Shoreline Historical
Oh,
Museum?
absolutely, yeah, I will make sure that copies are there. But the big place to get it, of course, is the Duwamish Longhouse, the cultural center of the Duwamish tribe. I always make sure that their shelves are stocked with books. And when you buy a book from the Duwamish, you help support the tribe. So that's a good reason to do it. But more importantly, it's because I want the information out. I'm doing the same purpose underlies the next book I'm working on, which is about the ancient and modern myths of Mount Rainier. Because it's not like people think. It is an entirely new idea, but not entirely new because the native people have been saying this for a long time. But in any case, the Chief Seattle book is available, and as far as I can tell, will be available for in the future because it's the only detailed biography of the man to appear.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David.
You're entirely welcome, Edie. It's always fun to be with you, and I'm honored to be in your presence today.
Thank you.